Lant Pritchett is professor of the practice of international development at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He's been there since 2007 and is currently on leave in Chennai, is that close? Chennai, India. He graduated from Brigham University with a bachelor's degree in economics, and he graduated in 1988 from MIT with a PhD, also in economics. After finishing his degree at MIT, he joined the World Bank and was with the World Bank, if I read things properly, until about 2007, when he joined the Kennedy School at Harvard. He held a number of positions in the World Bank in the research complex, including advisor to Lawrence Summers when he was vice president. He worked in Indonesia. He's been on leave from the World Bank in a number of prestigious places, and since 2007, as we mentioned, at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He's been part of a team that's produced many World Bank reports. I won't read the titles, they're very interesting and gripping, but we'll forbear. In addition, he's authored alone or with all of his 22 co-authors over 50 papers that have been published in refereed journals, chapters in books, or articles of various sorts. And as I read from his own vita, at least some of them are sometimes cited. In addition to economics journals, his work has appeared in specialized journals in demography, education, and health. And in 2006, he published his first solo-authored book, Let the People Come. We're pleased that he would come and present this lecture to kick off this important conference on development. And the title is Development, Some Big Pictures and Balloons. The balloons is the part that makes it interesting, I appreciate. Professor Pritchett.
So it turns out the balloons is not metaphorical. I actually have balloons. And I'm going to pass this bag of balloons around. I want everybody to take a balloon and pass it around so that everybody has a balloon. And at some point, these balloons will become relevant, believe it or not. So I'm going to start. You can get a balloon. Everybody gets a balloon. You can choose your own color. I'm also going to pass around some markers. I don't think we have a marker for every person. So we'll have to have a little cooperation, maybe take a marker for every second person or so. We got 40 markers and 70 people, so if you just kind of, every other person takes a marker. So, I have essentially worked, I'm 53 years old, and I have worked on nothing but development since I was 19 years old. So, and I'm going to try and give a 30-minute talk to give an overview of what I think are kind of important things you ought to know before you get too far into any discussion about development. So, the overview is, we're just going to talk a little bit about the consequences of the lack of economic development in particular. Then, secondly, I want to talk about development as a fourfold transition in rules systems. That's how I want to define a certain kind of development, as a fourfold transition in rules systems. And I'm pretty sure you don't know what that means. I hope you don't know what that means, because then it will be more interesting as you follow. And then I want to segue from that into the pathologies of poverty, and how we think about the pathologies of poverty differently in rich countries versus poor countries. So, right now in the world today, the gaps between the material standard of living of people in poor countries and people in rich countries are larger than they have ever been in the history of man by about an order of magnitude. They're about 10 times larger than they have ever been in history, at least. 10 is a conservative estimate. And one way of thinking about that is, this is just a picture of the weekly food consumption of a family of 4 in Germany and the weekly food consumption of a family in Chad. And that picture just says, here are the choices and resources that these 2 families can deploy. And basically, a family in Chad is roughly at the material standard of living of Adam and Eve, or whatever religious mythological characters came out of whatever thing. But roughly, people today in Chad have a standard of living not that much different than Paleolithic man. And people in Germany and the United States and Japan and a number of other countries have a standard of living that has expanded enormously. So one way you can think about this is you can think, at what level, in what year, did the leading economy in the world have the per capita income that we see in poor countries today? So kind of, what year did like the US have the GDP that China now has, or that India now has? So we'll project current levels of income back, and Mexico's income, and this isn't quite up to date, this is as of 2003, but these things don't really change that fast. Mexico's per capita income on this scale was $7,000 per capita. And if you say, when did the United States have that per capita income? It was 1941. So Mexico kind of is at the material standard of living that the United States was in 1941. If we think about China, and China is changing pretty fast, China, at least in 2003, was at the level the United States was in 1906. So this is not a level of standard of living that you've ever experienced, that your parents have ever experienced, that your grandparents have ever experienced. And China is pretty rich. If we start going back to countries like India, or going down, India's per capita income was $2,160 on this scale, which was the level of material standard of living the United States had before the Civil War. Now, India is still not a very poor country. And part of the problem is this scale doesn't get very good, so we have to go back even further to when Netherlands was the leading economy in the world, and say, Bangladesh on this scale only has a per capita income of $939. In what year did the Netherlands have that income? And the projection was, and the projections are kind of false, spurious precision, but 1,529. So Bangladesh, roughly today, has the material standard of living that no one alive has ever experienced in a rich country, and that basically is in the dim past of history. And I was trying to think, to even anchor this in Dutch history, what would we think of what happened in 1529 in Dutch history? And I only know one thing about Dutch history, and that's the Peace of Westphalia. And that happened in 1648. So we kind of, I think political scientists kind of date the origins of the modern nation-state system. So Bangladesh is at a level of per capita income that hasn't been experienced in Europe since before the beginning of the modern nation-state. So that's the world we live in which basically what's happened, and I'm going to go back, is because these countries have had pretty steady material progress for a very long time, they have basically left behind countries that haven't experienced that progress, so that basically now today in the world we have every conceivable standard of living, from incredible opulence that's now available to all of us who live in the West, to basically people living at the standard of living at or lower, actually, than Paleolithic man. So the world has basically come apart in terms of the experience of material standard of living. So now, what this also means, and I want to stress this a lot, because sometimes the issue of development and poverty get conflated in a very confusing way so that you look at the picture of people in Chad and you think, oh, poor people in poor countries are poor. Rich people in poor countries are poor. Meaning, and just as an example, so one of the things we know about the world is that as people get richer, they spend less of their share of their expenditures on food. It's called Engel's Law. It's the most reliable relationship in all of the social sciences. It always is true. Everywhere and always, as your expenditures expand, you spend less on food. So one way you can compare people's kind of total expenditures is you can compare the food share of expenditures. And if you look at poor people in rural India, they're spending 65% of all their expenditures go on food. What do poor people in the United States spend? Poor people in the United States spend about 17% of their expenditures on food. So if you look at the expenditures of kind of the bottom quintile in the United States, they spend about 17%. So what we know is that the poor in the United States are not nearly as poor as the poor in India. But what about the rich in India? Well, as you get richer in India, the share of your expenditures that goes to food declines, and this is the percentiles of income. And basically, the statistically richest people, of course there are people in India that are the Ambanis and are billionaires and all of that, but there's less of them than fit in this room, so they're kind of statistically not important. But if you look at the 95th percentile person in India, they are still in rural areas spending 40% of their income on food. Which means it's twice as high as the poorest people in the United States. So the issue of development isn't an issue that poor people in poor countries are poor. The issue of development is that the richest people in most poor countries have much lower material standards of living than even the poorest people in rich countries. And I know, partly from your faces, partly from having said this before, I know you don't believe this. But it's just true. Just no matter how you slice the data up, by any standard of material standard of living, the 95th percentile person in India is at a much lower standard of living than the 5th or 10th percentile poverty line person in the United States. Just no matter how you slice it up, whether you do it on education, whether you do it on health attainment. So development, therefore, one of the aspects of development is this transformation that increases the possibilities of people to enjoy better and better material standards of living. And the poor in poor countries right now have material standards of living that are at Paleolithic levels. The rich in poor countries have standards of living that are roughly what maybe your great-great-grandparents had, but still are not levels of standard of living that anybody in the Western countries is actually experiencing today. So, what is development then? What would be the development we're talking about? Well, development is, by its very nature, expresses a dynamic process that evolves over time, in which one thing stays the same but changes. Meaning, it develops, right? It changes, but without changing its fundamental nature, right? So, tadpoles, frogs, go through stages of their development as frogs, right? And they go from an egg to I hadn't even noticed this on the graph, to a talibud, to a tadpole, and they don't yet look or act or seem like they're a frog, but ontologically this is a frog. This is always a frog. It's just a frog at different stages of the development of its frogness. But it's a frog, right? So when we say that something is developing, what is it ontologically that is developing? Meaning, what is it that we're talking about that has the properties that we would talk about being developing? And I want to get this straight because there's two very different ways of thinking about development. One of them is that when we think about development, we're thinking ontologically about people as the unit. Right? People are what develop. Whereas when I want to talk about development, I want to talk about the ontological thing that's developing is a society. It's not a society just as an aggregation of people, but a society as a society. Okay? And what societies have is societies have rule systems. They have rule systems that govern the behavior of the individuals in the society. Right? Individuals don't have rule systems. Societies have rule systems. And development is the process of the transformations of the rule systems of societies that lead to outcomes for people that are better and better. But what is developing is the society, and it's a fourfold transformation. And the transformation is a transition in rule systems in four different domains. One is there's a transformation to a more productive economy. You go from a less productive to a more productive economy by acquiring rule systems that are capable of supporting more productive economies. Second dimension of the transformation of the society is you go to a responsive polity. The way in which sovereign power is exercised goes from the subjects to citizens. So rather than being a subject of a sovereign, the sovereign power is actively controlled by people acting as citizens. That's a transformation of the rule systems by which the power of the sovereign is exercised. There's a transformation towards capable administration, that these are rule systems for how organizations behave, that are more productive organizations that are able to do more things than the prior organizations. And finally, there's rule systems about how we treat each other, in which there's a transformation of the rule systems from how we interact, in which our interactions are structured primarily by the conditions of our birth, like whether I'm born a slave or born a serf or born a lord or born a noble, to a more equal rule system for how individuals act, in which we allow each person to act independent of the conditions of their birth. We treat everybody pretty equally. And again, not all these transformations have happened. So the history of the West is basically over time, a transformation in all four of these rule systems. I feel like I'm boring half of the room. Am I boring you? Not yet? Well, of course, that's a loaded question. Who's going to say yes, right? Okay. But this is really, and let me just illustrate, for instance, one thing I mean by developing a capable administration as independently from a productive economy. And some people recently did a study just about, is the government of different countries capable of doing really straightforward things that governments everywhere set out to do? So what they did is they deliberately mailed letters to the wrong addresses in countries to see if those letters came back. Now, all countries in the world are part of this International Postal Systems Convention that governs how you treat foreign mail. And part of the convention is if I get a letter from your country and I can't deliver it in my country, I send it back to you. And there's rules about how I send it back, and I send it back within 30 days. So all countries in the world are part of this International Postal Union that says the rule is if I can't deliver a piece of mail to the address in my country, I send it back to your country. So they just sent mail to 157 countries that was misaddressed. They were economists, so they made up names like Adam Smith Street. And, which they knew, I think they double-checked that it didn't really exist. And then they just said, you know, what percent of these letters, of these 10 misaddressed letters, come back within 90 days? Not the 30 days that the Postal Union says is the norm, but 90 days. And in, you know, countries with capability, like the Czech Republic and Finland and even Uruguay and Colombia, 90% of the letters came back within 90 days. They kind of did what the post office is supposed to do. 25 countries in the world, none of the letters came back ever. It was like you just mailed it into a black box. It just disappeared, which meant the country just didn't even have the administrative capability of, you know, complying with kind of really basic principles of international mail. And the striking thing is, you know, one of these countries was Somalia, right? Now, you mail a letter to Somalia, you probably get pirates back, right? I mean, no, nobody really expected a letter to come back from Somalia with anything positive, for certainly. But this wasn't just Somalia and Myanmar. This was Tanzania and Ghana and Egypt, Russia and Mongolia. Just their post offices, the quintessential bureaucracy, just didn't work, right? And even in the bottom half of countries by years of schooling, only less than a quarter of the letters ever came back. So this is sort of what I mean by rules systems. A post office is a rules system. It's how postal people behave, and it accomplishes functions, like making sure mail gets to addresses, and if it doesn't get to addresses, it gets back to wherever. And so these countries have transformed the rule system so they actually have the capability of delivering the mail and delivering back mail that is undeliverable, whereas most countries in the world are just at still incredibly low levels of the capability of their state to do anything. Right? I mean, it's not as if there's huge ideological debates about whether mail should get delivered, right? It's like this is something everybody says they're going to do, and it's not like it's really hard. You know, countries like Colombia and Uruguay, which are, you know, middle-income countries, can do it perfectly well. It's just you have to have done it. So the essence of development is about, in some sense, is about place, not people. It's about the society, not about the people in the society. And I think the best way to illustrate that is to think about migration, right? So if we look at a person and we say, geez, this person in Haiti is making 80 cents an hour, right? Now, they could be making 80 cents an hour because they, as a person, just aren't very productive. And so they're getting paid their product, but they're not very productive people. Now, if that were true, and it was a characteristic of the person that the person was unproductive, then if you allowed that person to come to America, their wage should be about 80 cents an hour, because their productivity was personal determined, right? Not place determined. So it's kind of a good thought experiment to say, what happens if we compare observationally equivalent, and this is a statistical term, but let's say we take a 35-year-old male, born in Haiti, educated in Haiti, same years of schooling, same age, same gender, and ask what does that person make in Haiti and what does that observationally equivalent person make in the United States? The answer is, if they're working in Haiti, they're making 80 cents an hour. If they're working in the United States, they make $8.25 an hour. So take exactly the same person, move them from an unproductive place to a productive place, and it turns out all of the productivity difference in that person was the place. Because the wage of the Haitian, educated in Haiti, turns out to be only about 85 to 90% of the wage of a born in America, educated in America person with the same skill level. Okay? So, why are Haitians poor? because they're in Haiti. It's not Haitians aren't poor because they're uneducated. Haitians aren't poor because they can't anticipate the future. Haitians aren't poor because they don't understand the value of a dollar. Haitians aren't poor because they don't work hard. Haitians are poor because they're in a place that has not, as a place and society, experienced the fourfold transitions in rule systems to more productive economy, more responsive polity, more capable society, and more equal society. And hence the people are trapped in undeveloped places. And hence what needs to happen, or what, so then if we think, what if we think about, geez, how would I help a poor person in Haiti? Well, the title of my book that he mentioned was Let Their People Come. So you might suspect I have an attitude towards migration. So one thing we can do is just let them come work in the United States. Not going to talk about that. I could talk at length about that. Not going to talk about that. But let's think about, we got a graph, because I'm an economist, so I have to have a graph. And we have a graph that has any indicator of human well-being. So all of you in this room that care about development or poverty or something, you care about something, right? You care about people being educated, you care about people having good health, you care about people having good nutritional indicators, you care about, maybe if you're an economist, you actually care about their level of material well-being. You care about something about people. But then there's this robust development, this fourfold transition that I call development in the society or country. And they're going to be linked, meaning people who live in societies with robust development, on average, are going to have much higher levels of any measurable indicator of human well-being than people that live in societies with much lower levels. But the relationship's not perfect. But we could then therefore think about three different kind of modalities or mechanisms or causal ways that we could approach the development problem. The first is we could just think of moving due east, right? We could just focus on the aspects of development of the society. We're going to make the economy, we're going to worry about policies that make the economy more productive. We're going to worry about policies or programs that make the polity more responsive. We're going to worry about policies or programs that make the administration, the capability of the administration within the society more capable, right? And we're not going to necessarily focus on this. We're going to focus on that in the hope or belief or empirically validated suggestion that if we can get it moved due east, if we can make the society more developed, well-being will, as a consequence, go up, right? Or we can think about going due north. We can say for any given level of development, we can make education better. We can make nutrition better. We can make whatever you care about. Think of whatever you care about. We can say in Bangladesh, which is somewhere down here on the overall robust development thing, we can say, well, Bangladesh is gradually going to move this way, but in the meantime, I want to focus my efforts on improving health, improving nutrition in Bangladesh now, right? And the third way we could think about it, and this is complicated to get into this graph, is we could think about just bringing up the bottom. We could say within Bangladesh, overall education is really crappy, but it's really crappier for some people than for other people. So I'm going to focus on making it less crappy for the people for whom it's the crappiest, right? So I'm going to focus on bringing the bottom up, not even necessarily focus on raising the overall quality of health care, but making sure that the poor get better health care. So that kind of classifies three ways one can think about improving human well-being through a developmental-like processes, right? But they lead to three completely almost ontologically different approaches. One approach is the system approach, right? We're going to work at the system level to make the system level work better, because when the system level works better, it's going to feed back and improve those other things in the due course of events. One is to work directly on the most obvious manifestations of the problem, which is the poorest of the poor. And one is to work at a sectoral level on, given all the chaos that's going on in Bangladesh, I'm going to focus at least to see if we can't get this nutritional program working and get nutritional levels higher, even in the overall lack of fourfold transformation of Bangladesh. Okay? So let me say one other thing, and then we're going to blow up some balloons. So one thing I want to make sure that you, in this, I want to make sure, and you might not have this in your head, so I might not have to beat it out of your head. But if it is in your head, I want to make sure I beat it out of your head. Okay? And that is to think of poverty as a personal pathology. Okay? Now, in rich countries, where we kind of believe there's a prosperous economy that everybody can participate if they feel like, and there's kind of an equal society, you know, everybody kind of has pretty good chances. And I'm not talking about the United States, I'm talking about, you know, Denmark, you know. I'm talking about these good European places, right? Everybody kind of has an equal chance. Then you could say, well, in this society, the people that are poor must have something wrong with them, right? They must not be very good at envisioning the future, and they are impatient, and so they don't save well because they're impatient. Or maybe they have worse pathologies, they're drug addicts, or maybe they're, you know, got even worse problems. They're just prone to violence and they don't have impulse control. And so you might think that the people who are poor in this society that otherwise is prosperous and equal have personal pathologies, so the way to focus on poverty is to focus on the people that are poor. Right? That's the completely wrong way to think about poverty in the developing world. Because in development, poverty is a system pathology, not a personal pathology. So, I was part of one of my many things, I was part of a book called Moving Out of Poverty, in which, and I'm glad you can't read these titles because I'll show them to you later, and then, so, in which I was part of a study that we just went out and interviewed tens of thousands of people and identified people who had been identified by their neighbors as having moved out of poverty, and we asked them in kind of open-ended interview, you know, structured interview situations, how did you move out of poverty, right? And we asked lots of people, how do people move out of poverty, right? Well, it turns out, the poor, these people in 17 different poor country settings that we had these interviews with, turns out they really believe in individual initiative. They don't believe in help. So if you ask how many of them got out of poverty because of NGO assistance, it's 0.3% of all the people we interviewed who move out of poverty named NGOs as being part of the causal factor, which is only slightly larger than the ones that said it was illegal activities that got them out of poverty. So, kind of, criminality and NGO assistance were neck and neck as paths out of poverty by people who escape poverty. What did people who escaped poverty, what was their own narrative of how they escaped poverty? Well, it was something they called individual initiative. And this is individual initiative. Non-agriculture means they went out and got some new job in non-agriculture. They had individual initiative in agriculture, which is they planted some new crop, they did some new thing. Some of them just said hard work. Some of them said asset accumulation. Some of them actually said, some help from government ended up being about 3%. But by and large, the people who moved out of poverty said, I moved out of poverty because I got a job. I moved out of poverty because I started a new business and it succeeded. Okay? So, Now what I would like is everybody take your balloon out. And I would like you to draw, like, just get a marker and draw like 3 dots on your balloon. You can do it too. What? You have a marker? They have a marker. Just draw like 3 dots on your balloon. Okay. Okay. Now, I want everybody to blow your balloon up. And once it's blown up, tie it off, because I don't want balloons going around the room. That's not the point. So blow it up, tie it off. Okay. We have a particularly strong-winded person. Who was that? We wouldn't say, yeah, like, wow, I thought we have helium quality balloons. Okay. Okay, so now with this balloon, I want to make 3 different points, right? And the first point is really simple and stupid. What happened to the dots on your balloon? What? They got further apart, right? Now, what did these dots do to get further apart? Nothing. They were just dots on a balloon, and the balloon, because of system changes of having introduced air from you into the balloon, got bigger, and as a natural consequence of the balloon getting bigger, the dots got further apart. So the causal mechanism of the increased distance between the dots had nothing to do with the dots. Is that analogy clear enough, or do I have to beat it like a dead horse? Okay? So the first point is, in this study that we did, we looked at what happened to poor people and rich people in the study areas we looked at. And what we mostly found is that when rich people got better off, poor people got better off. And the primary mechanism of moving out of poverty was living in a region in which lots of other people were moving up. So the fortunes of the rich and poor, area by area, they weren't linked one for one. The red line is kind of the connection in the sample. The black line is as if the poor, this is moving up of the poor and moving up of the rich. In some places, it looks like the fortunes of the poor and rich weren't that tightly related, but overall, the fortunes of the poor and the rich were exactly linked. You kind of got rich by living in a place, and these are, each individual dot is a village in this case. You kind of got rich, you got richer as a poor person in part by living in a place that got more prosperous. That was the main causal mechanism of getting richer. Now, the second thing that I want to say, and this is the last thing I want to say because it's 8:15, is balloons are fun. Right? Who doesn't love a balloon? Raise your hand. Okay. Now, I have a theory. I'm an economist, so what we have is theories, right? I even have a theory as to why balloons are fun. My son's here. This is not unusual, right? To have a theory as to why balloons are fun? Oh, dear. Okay. Balloons are fun because they're ontologically weird. And why are they ontologically weird? They're ontologically weird because most of us live in a two kind of stuff ontology. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if you're a 1-year-old or if you're a 2-year-old, you actually have about the ontology you have today, which is there's two kinds of things in the world. There's stuff and there's agents, right? Agents are things like your parents, cats, dogs. What do agents do? Agents act with purposes. And if you're going to explain the world about agents, you say they did this because they wanted to. You attribute teleological purposes to their actions as your way of explaining the world. Then what's the other thing in the world? Is stuff, right? Stuff is like this and like this. And we explain the world of stuff by saying stuff has properties, right? And when you sit on a chair, you expect the chair to be solid. Why? Not because the chair wants to support your weight. You don't attribute teleological purposes to the chair, right? Medieval people might have, but we don't. You sit on the chair and the chair holds you up because of the properties of the chair as stuff, right? So that's a two kind of stuff ontology. Agents who have teleological purposes and stuff. And most of the time when people say, explain this, what they mean is, tell me a story about the outcomes that is reduced to the teleological purposes of agents or the properties of stuff. So if I say, why did it rain? I'm asking for a story about why it rained that involves the property of clouds, right? If I ask, why did my girlfriend break up with me? Right? I'm asking for a story about the teleological purposes of agents. Now, we spend nearly all our life perfectly successful individuals with this two-stuff ontology. Matter of fact, as I'll get to in a minute, okay. I'll come back to that in a minute. When I'm back on this side of the stage, I'll come back to that. I'm going to go to this side of the stage. Okay. But there's actually, the world is a three kind of stuff ontology. There's something called systems. And systems as systems have properties that produce outcomes that aren't the teleological intentions of any agent in the system. So, the essence of understanding economics is that economic outcomes get produced that aren't the teleological intention of any agent in the economy, but is the result of many interactions of agents pursuing their teleological purposes within the constraints of a rule system, produces outcomes that are good or bad depending on the properties of the rule system, not the teleological intentions of the agents. So if you fix the rule system, you can fix the outcome. Now, we very rarely are called upon to engage in system ontology thinking. Why? Because if your girlfriend broke up with you and you engage in system ontology reasoning and why it happened, you're going to be an unsuccessful marriage partner. I'm just saying, most of our life, we get by really well with a two kind of stuff ontology. If we understand people and we understand stuff, we understand the world to manipulate it to be mostly successful individuals. But if you want to think about development, you got to think about system ontologies. It's rule systems which have fundamentally different ontological properties than agents. So the point is, countries aren't poor because people are evil. Countries aren't poor because people are stupid. Countries aren't poor because they're ruled by corrupt autocrats that are terrible people. Countries are poor because you can easily get trapped in a dynamic in which your rule systems are trapped in a low-level equilibrium dynamic and you can't escape it, and it gets difficult to escape. And until you transform the rule systems, the properties, the way that people will behave will continue to possibly both reinforce bad outcomes. See what I'm saying? So, thinking exclusively about people is not the right way to think about development. You got to think about system properties. And when system properties change, they then change all kinds of other things in unexpected ways. So just to conclude, we did this study on what happened to the lives of Dalits, who were the untouchables, well, they have various names, but Dalits, the untouchables in India, and what happened to them when you had market reform in India. Now you might think, well, what would happen to this social structure of caste and untouchability in response to market reform? Maybe nothing, maybe nah. Well, it turns out, basically, all kinds of caste practices have just gotten blown away in the last 20 years. So ritual practices about the Dalits being seated separately at weddings because they were ritually unclean doesn't happen anymore. In part because the economic situation changed, where Dalits went to the city, made a lot of money at the city, came back to the village with money so they didn't need to go to the higher caste individuals for loans and work. And when they were asked to come to the wedding and seated separately, they said, well, given that we opened with a prayer, I won't say kind of what they said, but they basically said, no, we're not going to do that we're not going to do that anymore. And so, Dalits being seated separately at weddings as a practice, even as late as 1990, after hundreds and hundreds of years of the government attempting to eliminate caste practices, in most villages, Dalits still were seated separately at weddings. 20 years later, it was gone. 20 years later, if a Dalit went to a wedding, they weren't seated separately. And it was a result of no one set out to make this happen. It happened as a transformations of these simultaneous changes in rule systems that were interacting. So these rule systems are complicated. They need to be thought of as a separate way of thinking about the world that's different from the way of the world that we normally engage in, and isn't just about helping individuals. We have to think not only helping individuals, but helping individuals transform the rule systems that they exist in ways that lead to a positive dynamic. So I'm going to stop there and take questions. I'm going to take 3 questions. See, I always take 3 questions at a time, because that way if there's a hard one, I have to answer it, and then hopefully you forget. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Her first, him, and then one other person. Got to be a third question. Then I'll take another set.
I was just wondering if you know what happened, why the birth of Dalit babies didn't go down in the Western Bloc.
No, I don't. You mean this one?
Yeah.
Why this one didn't change?
On the western side, it only went upward.
Nope, don't know. That was an easy question. So I'll take 2 more.
Do you have a theory about the causal movement of the 4 different rule sets, which ones affect which, and why this happened?
Okay. Here's question.
So my question earlier in the lecture, you were talking about how you interview people in various countries and they attribute their success to individual hard work. So obviously they didn't recognize that the society in which they were living was giving them more opportunities to be successful. So I'm curious if you have any anecdotal examples of of development measures that can help people be more successful that's not attributed to their political success.
Okay. So let's go back to this. And the question is, let's say we've got these 4 dimensions of the rule systems. And here, I draw it in various ways, moving outward is better, it's a more productive economy, more responsive polity. And, over time, we can imagine economies having gone from very low levels of economy, polity, and others. And I draw the lines with Microsoft Word in this using the squiggle thing for a reason. And the reason is I'm reasonably confident. I know for sure I don't know the answer to your question. I know for sure if anyone else knew the answer to the question, I would know that they knew it. So I'm reasonably confident no one knows the answer to that question. Lots of people have views about that question, like it's really important that we get democracy first because democracy will lead to a better economy. And other people say, actually, it may well be an authoritarian government does a pretty good job of bringing down rule systems for the economy before it becomes too democratic. And you actually get more rapid growth where you focus on getting the economy productive first and then follow that by the polity getting more responsive. The interactions between a democratic polity and a capable administration are complicated because oftentimes, India is a case in which the democracy is actually actively undermining the capability of the bureaucracy. So the corrupt politics are increasingly corrupting what were formerly reasonably uncorrupted bureaucratic practices. So it's actually the democratic polity serving as a negative dynamic on the things. So the answer is, we kind of know in the history of the West, these four things started low and ended high, right? So we look at Denmark, and Denmark started with kind of birth stratification where there was lords and serfs, and started with very unproductive economy, and started with kings who ruled over people. I don't know anything about that, but I use Denmark because nobody has strong feelings about that. If I say anything about France, people think, oh. Say anything about the United States, and everybody has a different opinion. If I say anything about Denmark, So what we do know is that all four of those things, over the long run from 1800 to today, all four of them happened in some pace, right? We do know in the world today, we do know that countries are doing this at very different paces. So we have countries moving fast, very fast in some dimensions, like China is, its GDP per capita, it's the productivity of its economy is just moving ahead at unbelievable, historically unprecedented pace. It's not getting any better polity, frankly, meaning its democratic practices aren't getting better. And there's a debate even about whether the underlying integrity and capability of the bureaucracy is getting better. So they don't move tightly together, and no one really knows the right sequencing. I don't think there is a right sequencing, but if there is a right sequencing that were universal, we would know it, and we don't know it, so I suspect there isn't a universal right sequencing. And most people who talk about right sequencing just have strong opinions. So you could say, and one of the things that prevails, this is a long answer, but one of the things that prevails in development is wishful thinking. It's the move from, wouldn't it be nice if, to it is, right? So I agree with everybody that it would be nice if more progress on democracy led to more progress on a productive economy. I agree. That'd be nice. That'd be terrific. Terrific if all good things went together. Empirically, that's not what the data say. So, but in the development world, if you really believe in democracy, you might then want the data to turn out that democracy is good for everything, right? So that's demonstrably not true. It's demonstrably not true that we need everything to happen at once. Your question is, yeah, there's lots of things that can be done, and it's basically about making opportunities that people hope exist, really exist. And there are lots of ways in which governments and policies can and cannot either inhibit the individual initiative efforts of people or facilitate them. And there are simple examples like, so you guys are probably too young to remember this, but you guys have heard of the IMF, right?
Yes.
Now most people hate the IMF, and with good reason. Because, the IMF's role in the international system is sort of the role of the sheriff. If you don't pay your mortgage, they come throw your crap in the street, right? right? A lot of people will throw you out, and you pay your debts. So that's the IMF's role in the world economy. So most people do, right? I was living in Indonesia during the economic crisis right around the fall of Suharto, and we were traveling actually on vacation through the Indian country, through the Indian countryside on vacation, and I was working for the World Bank. And we were just happened to be in a conversation at a restaurant in some village on an island in Indonesia. And, the waiter says, "Oh, what are you doing?" So I work for the World Bank. So I love the IMF. What? What? I had never heard that phrase. I had never heard those 3 words in that sequence. I heard the word love, the word IMF. Never heard it in that sequence. So I said, well, why? Well, because there was a crop that was really profitable, which was growing cloves for clove cigarettes, that had been completely had a monopoly. It wasn't the natural product of the market. It was the Suharto family had monopolized the marketing of cloves so that everybody who grew cloves had to sell them to this government-dominated monopoly, which was really just a front for his kids to make a lot of money off the farmers. And one of the IMF mandated reforms as part of the crisis was to get rid of the clove monopoly, where all of a sudden, people who believed that if they worked hard and grew cloves, they could maybe get a little further ahead, got further ahead because some artificial restriction on their being able to market cloves got blown away. And they really made a ton more money selling cloves. So, yes, there are lots and lots of ways in which you can unleash the initiative. My main point is the view that the problem with poor people is that they lack initiative, I have just never seen any evidence for. And it's not the narrative that anybody, either the people who did move out of poverty or the people who didn't, because we also interviewed a sample of people who did move out of poverty and said, well, how would you move out of poverty? And unambiguously hard work is what they said. So they believe in opportunity, even more so than maybe is really present in their economy. But when you make it happen, and there are lots and lots of ways to make it happen, it really does work. So 3 more questions. And then we should go to ice cream, right? Okay, so keep in mind that your question is between, okay, 1, 2, 3.
When you brought up the Indy example and how the elimination of the caste system and untouchables, that was kind of an unintentional side effect of system change. So I think it's interesting to a lot of us in the room who are obviously interested in humanitarian work or development, how as people on the outside of the system, if there's no intention, do we affect that kind of change? Do you know what I mean? Is it possible to affect change from without side of the system? Or does the change have to come from within the system?
Good question.
So you talk about 3 different ontological entities. I was wondering what epistemological requirement is necessary to recognize that 3rd entity of a system. So should you trace it from the matter and the stuff that the system that appropriates the agents and the stuff? Or should you blow up a balloon to recognize it? Or what's the real requirement?
Yeah. Wow. We're going to use epistemology and ontology in the same sentence. At 8:30 at night. Yeah. On a weekly.
I have a feeling my question was similar to that, but I'm not totally sure that I understood it. So I'm just going to kind of shoot. Along with that, kind of you talked about those 3 things, and I kind of translated that in my head to be subjects and objects, and then systems, in a sense. And my question kind of was, obviously, from what I understood, your point is that systems are the thing that we always forget, and the thing that ends up making, the most difference in development. And I'm just kind of wondering how that process of change comes about, whether, humans as subjects are able to kind of bring about that system change, I guess. Or basically, is it coming from those people, or is it coming from some outside source, or does it just naturally evolve over time? I'm just kind of wondering how that evolves, I guess.
Okay. So let me answer all 3 of those questions are kind of the same question. So the first thing is, I make a big distinction between humanitarian and development. And part of this whole talk was to make that clear, right? Because humanitarian work can or cannot be development work. And often humanitarian work isn't development work. in my view, because in order to do the humanitarian thing, we short-circuit the system, right? So if there's a problem in Haiti, frankly, the best way to get it done is just go around all the Haitian systems and drop in capacity into Haiti and just do it. But that doesn't have any positive feedback loop on Haitian systems. Because if you drop in and do it and drop out, Haiti's the same Haiti as it was before, right? So the real question is, are there ways of doing good things that are more likely to lead to the consequential changes in the rule systems? And there the answer is, change has to come from the inside. Unless, I don't even know. I was going to say, unless you want to revisit colonialism, take over and eliminate that these societies have a political sovereignty. It's not really on the agenda right now. But there are ways of doing development that cocoons development, humanitarian and development activities from the development of the internal dynamic of the systems in ways that engages it. The ways that engage it are much harder, much messier, much more difficult, much less likely to produce impressive results for your donors in the short run. But in the long run, it's what's needed, because unless you transform the capability and the rule systems of the system, it's just mitigation. And I'm not against mitigation, in the three ways you can help, right? A lot of these bottom-up a lot of this kind of stuff kind of takes the mode of being cocooned from the general thing, where we'll help these individuals, but without worrying about the overall structural constraints they face. The epistemological question is just too hard. I don't think there is a good answer to that, in the sense that, we were discussing this with Dan. Right now, for instance, in development economics, a big fad is to do randomized control trials as a way of learning about what works, right? I think it's just complete hoo-ha. Because the system is not the kind of thing around which we can do a randomized control trial. So what do we end up focusing on? We end up focusing on things that can be individuated. So if I give him this treatment and her not that treatment, what's the outcome of him versus her? But that's not a system change. So the epistemological conditions for learning about systems are incredibly, incredibly difficult, because systems are complex, dynamic systems with emergent properties, and tinkering with them is a really complicated, dangerous, and very difficult to know in the end, if Dalits got better, what exactly was the mechanism, right? So we can observe that Dalits all of a sudden had more power in these village relationships and all kinds of caste practices ended. It happened during the period of market liberalization. We can point to some causal channels, but frankly, once we admit we're in systems areas, we have sciences of stuff. We have really good sciences of stuff, right? Really good. Really good, really impressive. Like we send rockets to the moon and stuff. Amazing technologies that are a result of having really good epistemological basis for really developing really firm sciences of stuff. We have enormously weaker epistemological systems and progress on agents, right? I mean, after all, just look at your own life, right? How successful are you? Of course, I speak as an economist. We're not typically very successful. But I'm just saying, we don't have a good science of why our loved ones do stuff, and we make mistakes in our most intimate relationships because we don't really have a good understanding of the interior mental states of other human beings, right? Systems we have no science of yet. So that, I don't even think we're to the point of worrying about epistemological conditions. We don't even have a science of it to which we can then worry about the epistemological level of science. Which gets to your thing. My answer to this is what I call problem-driven iterative adaptation. And this would take an hour and a half for me to explain, but basically it's glorified muddling through. Since we're dealing with complex systems with lots of feedback loops, and since we're dealing with rule systems, we know for a fact that you can be enormously successful in changing rule systems, because I was born in 1959. The way in which people got treated in 1959 because they were women is night and day relative to the way they get treated today. That was because of purposive action of people, women, saying, we don't like the way these rule system constrains us because of our conditions of birth, and we're going to consciously act to change the way these rule systems work. And they've been wildly successful. Maybe not successful enough, not completely successful, but believe me, if we went back to 1959, we were shocked at the things people said and did routinely as a way of, this was the rule system, right? So all kinds of spectacular successes in the world have happened because of purposive action of agents to change the way rule systems work, right? So just because we don't have science of it doesn't mean that it can't be successful. But if we want to be better at it, we want to be more structured about how we're going about it, and more thinking through, what am I doing, on what level am I intervening, what would I expect the outcomes to be, what would I expect the intermediate outcomes to be, am I seeing those, if I'm not seeing those, how else would I act to make it happen? So tighter evidentiary feedback loops around kind of the interventions at the more systemic scale level. So not tighter feedback loops around, if I give him 12 kilograms of rice, does his child get better nutrition? That's kind of a relatively easy science, but more things around what are the ways in which we can, unleash the economy? What are the ways in which we can have better informed policies that aren't structured along ethnic and caste lines, such that basically issues of service delivery and improving the well-being of people aren't politically salient objectives of the elected representatives? These are the kind of questions around which you can start thinking, let's muddle through in a structured way. And I realize this sounds incredibly unambitious, but it's really incredibly ambitious relative to lots of else that's happening. So let's stop and have ice cream, right?
Thank you, Professor Pritchett. We're very happy that you can be with us, and we all have benefited from what you've had to said. Need to take care of one item of business. We have a little gift we give at the Wheatley Institution for people who give these keynotes for us, and we'd like you to have that. This is a peace pipe we have made from the Choctaw tribe.
I did not expect to get a pipe.